Speakers were down.
Should we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I think you can.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you for those of you that are joining our presentation today, titled Podcasting Plants, and for those of you that will be watching the recording in the future. Today we will be talking about podcast, agricultural communication, and extension audiences. And before we start, the presenters and I would just like to provide some brief introductions about ourselves. My name is Melissa Preniveau, and I am currently the operations manager at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. It's also known as IATP. We are headquartered in Minneapolis, and we work on the local and global level at the intersection of policy and practice to ensure fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade systems. And I'm also a graduate of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities Master's Plant Pathology program. Rebecca, if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Sure, thanks, Melissa. I'm Rebecca Swenson, an associate professor in CFANS, which is the College of Food, Agriculture, and Natural Resource Sciences at the University of Minnesota. And I teach agriculture communication marketing classes and do research connected to science communication, and worked with Melissa on this project when she was a graduate student.
Hi, my name is Troy McKay. I work alongside with Dr. Swenson. I teach digital media production and the agricultural communication and marketing program at the University of Minnesota. My background is I worked in the film and television industry for 15 years prior to making my transition into higher education, where I've primarily taught media production courses. So I'm on here to speak to you about actually producing your own podcasts after we get through some of the research.
Well, let me advance a slide here. So the presentation today will be split up into 3 sections. I will be taking the first, and Rebecca will be doing the second. And as we mentioned, the first 2 sections will be based off of a paper that Rebecca and I co-authored that was published earlier this spring. And then Troy will be taking the last section, which will be providing us tips and tricks about how to create podcasts. As I mentioned, the first 2 sections are based off of this paper Rebecca and I co-authored titled Talking Plants, Examining the Role of Podcasts in Communicating Plant Pathology Knowledge. It is available on the Journal of Applied Communications website, and it is free to download and read if you are interested. For those of you that may be unfamiliar, plant pathology is the study of plant diseases. And I love this quote that extension programs and thus extension specialists are the face of plant pathology. The main responsibilities of extension plant pathologists, amongst their many other responsibilities, are to conduct applied research on plant diseases and to translate research results into teachable and practical information. And one way for them to do this is to acknowledge that different learning styles exist. So we looked at the VARC model in our paper, and this was created by Neil Fleming in 1987. And the model can be used to identify different learning preferences. And as you can see, each letter represents a different mode. And so visual are people that like to learn via images, and examples of this are movies and diagrams. Oral are for people that like to hear the information. Examples are discussions or music. Read write is people that like to look at the physical words, so taking notes or reading textbooks. And then kinesthetic is for people that like to learn by having hands-on experiences. And what I like most about this model is that it's based on the idea that everyone can learn, but each person learns differently. And then it's possible for a specific learning style to have a combination of different modes. And if they do, this is called a multimodal learning style. And an example of this, of a potential multimodal learning style, are podcasts. So a little background on podcasts. The term podcast can be broken down into two parts: pod, which comes from the Apple iPod, and cast, which comes from broadcast. And the term podcast can represent a single episode or an entire series or show. And in 2004, Mark Curry from MTV was tired of manually downloading audio files. So he developed a program so that it would do it automatically for him. And the open source community took this software and furthered it to create the podcast directories that we are familiar with seeing today. So additional podcast background, as many of us know, podcasts have many benefits as a communication platform. And I will talk about the benefits by talking about the different groups that are utilizing podcasts currently. So many groups use podcasts, but I'd like to highlight a couple here. News media like to use podcasts to extend their brands and their reach. They repurpose content from other programming to create podcasts, such as utilizing a clip from a radio show or a news segment, and then making it available for other people to listen to. And this allows them to reach audiences that are beyond their antenna range or who would not be available during that live segment. For medical education, teachers and professors like to use podcasts because they're inexpensive to create, they're easy to distribute to the students, and they can create better learner engagement compared to traditional lectures and textbooks. And students like them because it allows them to have better balance in their learning, service, and personal lives. They're portable. Everyone can have the same uniform education without having to travel to the same location at the same time. And they can control their information abundance by listening to as much or as little information at any given time. And also they can listen to the podcast without taking up more time in their schedule, such as when they're commuting or exercising. And then many extension groups are utilizing podcasts, but I'd like to provide some examples of egg extension experiences with podcasts. An example is the New South Wales website, where they found that in a 13-month period, 13 dairy podcasts actually generated 3.65 times more downloads than their top 13 PDF publications. The University of Arkansas, after including podcasts on their website, found traffic to increase by over 200% over the next year. And then Texas A&M University, they're the first land-grant university to create podcasts. And they did this in 2004, and it was called Egg Weekly News. They had no budget, and they intended to reach just egg producers, but they ended up reaching general news producers and mass media. And then the University of Minnesota Egg Extension Program has a podcast called What's Killing My Kale? And the podcast reached the unintended audience of hobbyists when they were trying to target Midwest fruit and veggie growers. So now onto the paper. We found that podcasts can be powerful and useful tools to share information, but we also found a gap in literature on how podcasts might be used to share plant path information. Apologies for the dog noises. Excuse me. So we have 3 research objectives. The first is to identify characteristics of podcasts discussing plant pathology topics. The second is to determine how the content of podcasts align with fundamental units of plant pathology knowledge. And the third is to use the VARC model as a guide to investigate if plant path podcasts use multiple instructional strategies and information delivery modes. And then just to say that plant path is an abbreviation for plant pathology, so you may hear that as I continue on. For our methods to collect our podcasts and our pool of data, we collected the data in 2019. And in 2018, the most used platforms to listen to podcasts were Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So we used 7 keywords related to plant pathology to search these platforms, and we removed any duplicated shows and ended up with 878 podcast shows. And from there, we removed any shows that had descriptions not in English, and then we read each show's description and every episode within the show's description to remove any that may not be relevant to our study. So an example of this are a lot of religious podcasts like to use the word plant or plants. So because those weren't related to our study, we removed those. And then we ended up with a pool of 197 podcast episodes. And these episodes encompassed 40 different podcast shows. And to analyze our data, we use content analysis, and we based our analysis off of Neuendorf's guidelines. So some cons to utilizing content analysis are that it's time consuming and that biases can be between researchers when they're coding, but pros are that it's unintrusive means of analyzing interactions. It's pretty inexpensive to do. Basically, it's just your time commitment. You don't have to use any software if you don't want to, or fancy software. And it quantifies and analyzes qualitative data by coding it into manageable code categories. And a collection of these code categories is called a code book. And these are the codes that we had in our code book. So for affiliation, we coded them by listening to what the hosts and guests identified as their occupations or titles. For podcast style, we based these off of Pod School and their styles that they presented. Schedule, we determined if the shows were still active or not and how frequently they posted. For genre, we grouped the podcast into broad themes. And then one of our biggest codes are the unit of plant pathology knowledge. And to determine these units, we analyzed 19 introduction to plant pathology books and interviewed 2 University of Minnesota faculty for essential topics to include when you're talking about plant pathology or teaching about plant pathology. And that's how we ended up with our units. And then lastly, for notes, we identified if the podcast had utilized show notes and if they did, what level they did. And to determine the reliability between researchers, we looked at the Krippendorf's alpha for 10% of the content. And this ranged from 0.79 to 1 for each element in the codebook. And as a reference, a score of 1 is considered perfect agreement between the researchers. And now I'll hand off the next section to Rebecca.
Awesome. Thank you, Melissa. Good setup. So I'll talk a little bit real quickly about what we found connected to each of our research objectives. Could you advance the next one? So the first research objective was really centered on characteristics of plant podcasts. We were curious at what these looked like big picture. So Melissa already talked a little bit about our data pool. It ended up being about 119 approximately hours of podcasts to look at. And as she said, it spanned about 40 podcast shows. And so things that we looked at, first of all, would be length. And we found a wide range of length that was from 3 minutes all the way up to almost 3 hours for podcast length. But the average episode ended up being about 36 minutes within this data pool. And then we also looked at, with those that were active, how frequently were they releasing episodes? And it was pretty irregular. There wasn't a lot of shows that had a regular setup. The ones that did ended up being about a weekly schedule. So you can kind of see on the table on the slide, weekly episodes ended up being about 30% of our data pool. The next thing that we looked at, you can flip to the next slide, was host affiliation. So we wanted to see, who were these hosts and who are the guests that were appearing on these shows. And it ended up being overwhelmingly an academic set of guests and hosts, followed by applied. So the applied group would be people who either own or manage or work on a farm or a vineyard or an orchard. And then followed by company spokespeople. And company spokespeople had a wide range of roles. It could be salespeople, it was public relations representatives, it was engineers from different organizations like seed companies or biotech companies or chemical companies. And then a pool of unknown people who did not reveal their affiliation. Something that was interesting that we looked at too was production styles. So what was the setup of the podcast episode? And so we saw overwhelmingly people were using repurposed content, which would be kind of replaying either clips from radio shows or sharing things that had happened already at meetings or trainings, and then followed by interviews. And we did find that people were pretty consistent with their podcast style. So once they picked one, they kind of stayed in that lane. So if they were doing interviews, they stayed in that interviewing lane, which is not, we can return to that idea with our recommendations. It's not necessarily something that people who are producing a podcast need to do. And then finally, genres. So we looked at topics that were being covered, and overwhelmingly agriculture is the genre that we found. But there was some gardening, some direct plant pathology information, and then some history information as well being shared. So after characteristics, we looked at what were those fundamental units of plant pathology knowledge that were being shared within each episode. And as Melissa said, we developed these ourselves by looking at textbooks and interviewing some professors to say, what are the units of plant pathology knowledge that you try to cover within your courses, within all different aspects of teaching plant pathology. So these are the ones that we came up with a description and a definition of what they are up there on the screen. So on the next slide, you can see what we found. So one kind of key idea is that we found basically all fundamental units were represented within podcasts. So it does showcase that podcasts are a good way to share a lot of different information. The three top ones would be management and prevention of plant diseases. And in this type of episode, often there was an audience member who called in or wrote in with a particular question, either social media or email, or using a website form to ask some questions about a particular disease. Also, hosts tried to, give some tips for watching for certain diseases during different seasonal times, or different areas of the country too, and then described what to do when trying to manage that disease. Fungal disease was the next one that we saw, and often here the discussion focused on what are the different types of fungal diseases, what are some signs or symptoms or life cycles of those diseases. And then finally, we saw sort of that influence of the environment, which makes sense. Plant disease often results from interactions between the host plant, the pathogen, and the environment. And so we saw, first of all these were covered, and then also it really used the same format that's often done in extension education materials. And then the final research objectives is really connected to the VARC model. And the thing I guess I'll talk about most was the use of show notes. So we saw a wide range of podcasts using either no show notes or some detailed show notes. And I think it's interesting to note because there were some great examples, especially regenerative agriculture podcast, who use really detailed use of show notes. And for a field like plant pathology, this can be very important. They had things like timestamps that could function as like an index for the episode. They listed sources and references that you could use to follow up on that technical information, and then gave some contact information as well, so you could kind of follow up with any feedback or questions that you had. So what we found led us to a series of kind of broad recommendations for those who are considering podcasts, either for plant pathology or other extension areas. One is to use those fundamental knowledge units to guide your podcast planning. We thought those those fundamental units for whatever topic it is that you're using can really help you cover a wide range of content, as well as really sort of target specific audience segments based on their level of knowledge, and sort of use it to scaffold learning and fill in any information gaps with particular audiences. It also could provide a way to deepen learning on technical topics. So really sort of purposefully covering some of those deeper technical knowledge pieces in something like a podcast where people can review that information multiple times and hear it not only at a training, but in a different setting. Our second recommendation is really to take advantage of repurposing content. Sometimes when somebody is creating a podcast, it's like feeding the beast. You have to keep coming up with new content. And this doesn't necessarily have to be different content than what you're already producing for an extension program. You can reuse the information that you're sharing at other events and through other programming. And it does give people the opportunity, again, to review that at their own convenience and pace without some environmental distractions that might be happening at meetings and other events. And you can use this to sort of consider, how you might increase your communication effectiveness and efficiency with using some repurposed content and reach new audiences. And again, we saw a wide, often podcasts kind of stayed in the format that they picked, but you don't necessarily have to. Mixing some repurposed content with different interviewing styles might be a good idea for somebody who's creating and planning podcasts. Our third recommendation is really to use podcasts to expand the voices and affiliations of experts. We were really excited to see the high involvement from academic experts, because then you can feel like that content is definitely accurate and reliable. But we also thought people who are producing podcasts for extension might think about how to include multi-hosts and guests with different types of professional affiliation too, to expand those perspectives and expertise and different motivations for sharing information too. And that can maybe help extension expand the program's audience base. And then our fourth recommendation is really to not forget about show notes. They really are a beneficial resource for people who are planning these as part of an extension program. And really looking at some of those good examples that we had that included timestamps and links to additional resources and transcripts of episodes. And we thought this is important to note, especially for something like plant pathology, which is such a visually driven field, because show notes can help really share images and diagrams and help with that proper identification of different plant diseases, especially when you're only listening to that information. It can be an important way to include those visuals, and then also to send people to additional information to follow up. And then also, thinking about the VARC model, you've got people who are attending your meetings and events in person. This can be a way to include people who would rather listen to that information, and then show notes can help people who might be hearing impaired know where to find that information afterwards. So those are our main top recommendations that we had based on our research. One thing that we did is we looked at, what was available in our paper, not really what audience want to hear. So that's definitely an opportunity for additional research. And we also didn't look at, what are people sort of retaining and learning and actually using based on the information shared within a podcast. Something else that we found is really, there was some discussion on it takes a lot of time to produce and distribute podcasts to audiences. So extension audiences didn't even want to start embarking on podcast production, but we invited Troy here to showcase that actually it's pretty easy to acquire the skills needed to develop and deliver podcasts, and you can do so with kind of little financial investment and little technical background. So I'll turn it over to Troy, who will share some hands-on tips for podcast production.
Thank you. So yeah, there's some great information in there. Thank you for the research. And I'm going to try to tie in some of those takeaways and recommendations into what I'm speaking about. So today, yes, we're going to be talking about how to get started with podcast production. And we've heard a lot about how they're being used. And each one of you that's tuning into this or listening to the recorded version probably is toying with or having an idea, or maybe you are involved in producing podcasts. So you might be bumping up against that technological wall, and you might be looking for resources, and that's why you're here. So we're going to talk about how to get started, some tools, tips, and tricks, and just ways to format and things to think about with audience, building your audience. So you can go to the next slide here. So the equipment options are vast. We're in a really awesome time for people to produce their own content. It can be as easy as producing it with the phone you have in your pocket. As you can see down here, I've got just a little sample of a microphone that's being able to be plugged into an iPhone. And that's all they're using to record. They're recording straight into their audio notes, or you could record into iMovie and record an entire podcast. Or on the left or the right side of the screen, you can see it can get really, really technical, and it can look like a studio production. So yes, it is easy to produce podcasts, but one of the big things that pushes audiences away are it's great content, but I can't listen, I can't hear what they're saying, or the sound is so bad that I'm not going to tune in. So we've all probably listened to stuff like that, and you're like, I can't do this anymore. So I'm going to try to get you to some solutions to that. Also, I've included some hyperlinks in here to, I think Rebecca is going to make this available to everyone. So I get a lot of questions about, hey, where do I buy this, or how do I acquire some of these materials? I'll talk specifically about a few items, but this hyperlink in here gets you to this little, that little microphone. I've never used it. It's made by a reputable company, and I thought it was pretty interesting because I haven't used that thing, and it looks like, oh, this is like so simple now. We can go to the next slide. So we're going to start off with equipment, and this is where I get a lot of questions about things. You don't necessarily need to have a high-end microphone to create a podcast. Again, we could be creating a podcast directly out of this Zoom presentation. There is decent audio. However, for not a lot of investment, for this microphone here is $70 or $69, so $70 on Amazon. This is the microphone that I use in my classroom to teach podcasting to our digital or our agricultural communication students. In this microphone, I would highly, highly recommend because it's very, very versatile. You're going to see all those plugs on there. Now, again, I don't want to get you going, oh my gosh, how do I plug this thing in? There's a bunch of different technological things. This is really a plug and play. And the reason I like this microphone is because it is USB adaptable. So you can plug it directly into your computer as long as you have a USB port, or if you've got one of the new Apple products, you'll just have to buy an adapter. But you can also, you see the 3 prongs, that's called an Xlr adapter, and that's professional audio. You have 3 connection ports, and that can go into a digital recorder. So it gives you some flexibility, which we'll talk about digital recorders here and the advantages of that. But one of the best thing about this microphone is the port on the right hand, the top right hand corner, is made for headphones. So I highly, highly recommend, if you're recording podcasts, to wear headphones. Don't worry that you're going to look silly or it's not comfortable or something like that. You want to listen to headphones, because the last thing you want to do is to record 30 minutes of podcast information, and then you listen to it back and there's crackly static and all of this happening. If you are monitoring and listening to the audio that you're recording in real time, you're going to be able to stop the recording. You're not going to be wasting that production time, and you're going to be able to understand, am I recording? Am I talking too loud? Am I recording too soft? All of these adjustments. So over the ear headphones are the recommendations. So you're blocking out other sound. But this, and again, this can be, if you're a gamer, you're good to go because you have a microphone and you've got a headset that's plugged right in. But it doesn't have to be an expensive set. Even earbuds will work, but I wouldn't recommend those if you have a microphone already built in. Go to the next slide, please. So equipment options into digital recorders. So when I was talking about the XLR attachment, that opens up flexibility. So yes, you can take that microphone, plug it directly into a computer. For $70, you have an awesome microphone that's going to sound professional. It's going to give you clarity when you're speaking and giving that information to your audience. This is something that, if you want to take it to the next level, this is a Zoom HN4 Pro. It's a handheld recorder. Really, it's kind of a beefed up iPad or an iPod. You really have different recording options on here is why I'm including it. We use this in our classes as well, so students can monitor the sound a little and have some different adjustments they can make. So it's called recording level. It's actually called gain, but on these devices, it's the recording level. So if I have Rebecca as a guest and I am face-to-face with her, I can plug in a microphone for her and I can plug in a microphone for me. I'm a loud talker, so I'm going to be talking at a loud volume. Rebecca, we'll say Rebecca is a soft talker. In your recording on this device, you can adjust the recording level per microphone. So you can have a good recording for each person involved in the podcast. Now, this is limiting. It only goes up to actually 4 tracks. So you could technically record from 4 different microphones, but it really works best with 2 microphones. The other thing about this particular type of recorder is it records to a digital a SanDisk. I'm blanking. It records to a chip. So you're going to have to be able to transfer that onto a computer, which might involve a whole other process. So the advantage of the microphone plugged into your computer, it's recording locally, it dumps a file onto your computer. The H4N Pro is just going to give you better audio for not a lot of money. That's about $170 for that. And think of the first image where I show a studio and they have the board with all of the levers and the switches. Essentially, that's what you can do with this little tiny device. So this YouTube link talks you through a tutorial on how to set it up and how it works and all that good stuff. So we can go to the next slide. Again, I would highly recommend going directly into your computer with a microphone when you're starting this. You can record into software. You can record into if you're familiar with iMovie or Final Cut or Premiere, Audacity. We're going to cover some software here in a few slides, but those will take that microphone audio and bring it directly into an editor, and it creates a clip for you. So it's pretty simple. Or you can use this when you're doing a Zoom or you're using a Zencast, which I'll talk about in a few slides here. And we'll move on to the next one, please. So software. We've got a website called Agricast. So you can find this at umnagricast.com. And you're going to see a home page that has a toolbar. On the left side of the screen, you see Agricast, agricultural and environmental media, and you'll see the toolbar home, UMN, AECM programs, for so on and so forth. If you go over to the K-12 teachers resources, you can drop down and there's going to be digital media production tools. And you're going to find different types of access to tools, free software and paid software. So I just did screen grabs of this, so it'll look a little bit different. But on the right side of the screen in the burgundy with the yellow print, you'll see WeVideo, Filmora, and DaVinci Resolve. Those are 3 video editing softwares that are all free. WeVideo requires you have an account with an email address. DaVinci Resolve is actually a fantastic editing suite that you can download the whole kit and caboodle from the internet with no membership or anything. Filmora requires an email address as well, but they're all good basic softwares. Just because they're video doesn't mean they're only video. They do a fantastic job with audio. You don't need an audio or a video clip to edit audio. They will accept audio, and you can bring those in and edit and chop up your audio. You can bring up sound levels. You can take out humming noises. You can take out the fan that's overhead in a room that you didn't hear. There's a bunch of different options you can do with the software. DaVinci Resolve is going to be the most robust and probably, I wouldn't say the most complicated, but it is more complicated than WeVideo. Now, on the website, there's going to be tutorials that are built into each link. So if you like the WeVideo, you can click on the WeVideo icon. It'll take you to the site that'll walk you through. It's kind of for beginners in their I would call them the basics, nuts and bolts of video and audio editing, about 20-minute tutorials. On the right-hand side with the gold and the burgundy print, you're going to see you might already have these things. You might have iMovie, GarageBand, Final Cut Pro, Adobe Premiere, so on and so forth. Those are all obviously you need subscriptions or you have to buy the software. We have tutorials to get you up and going with those as well. So if you already have one of these things and are familiar with it, or you have it and you're not familiar with it, check out the tutorials on Agricast. So it's a good resource. There's also some other things specific to podcasting with your phone, which those are more for teacher resources when they're trying to reach a classroom of 20 students to produce like a 20-second audio production for a classroom assignment. So I would steer away from those, and these softwares are the ones that you are going to want for audio production. There's other production software. The main one that you'll probably hear about is Audacity, and Audacity I don't really like because I feel like it's limiting and it's kind of complicated and clunky. So I would stick with the video editors that we were talking about. So moving on to this other software solution. In the research report, you heard bringing in multiple perspectives and bringing in guests and bringing in researchers and people from organizations and industry. And you're like, okay, how am I going to do this? I don't have time to drive up 40 miles to sit down with a microphone and get everything going. One of the beautiful things that we have now, obviously we're doing this over Zoom. A lot of people do stuff through Zoom. Zoom is a little bit limiting when it comes to audio production. And Zencastr is another free software. It requires you to just have an account. They don't send me anything. I'm not feeling like I'm on any lists. So don't be afraid to sign up for a free account. It's really easy to use, and it is outstanding for remote podcasts. If you're doing a remote interview, how it works, there's a couple different things that are for its advantage. So say, again, I'm using Rebecca as my guest, my soft-spoken guest, right, Rebecca? So Rebecca is, I don't have time to meet with her. She is miles away, but she has awesome information for my podcast. I set up a time with her that I send her an email through Zencastr. She gets a link to her email. It's a hyperlink. She clicks on it and it comes up on her screen, an entire Zencastr page that has audio recording WAV files and all the stuff that she can see but doesn't really have control of. I have control of everything, where I have the exact same interface that I'm looking at. I can see Rebecca's on there. I can see her individual waveform bouncing, so I know that it's recording. And I press click and record, and I start recording, and we have our dialogue. So pretty much like Zoom, but this is the difference between what's happening is Rebecca's computer is recording the actual audio file locally on her computer. So as we're recording the Zoom, this is all being recorded into one file. And I believe it's Melissa, no, it's going to be Heather probably has the ultimate recording of this, where it's going, our audio is getting compressed through this link, and it kind of sounds tinny, and it doesn't have the highest audio quality. The highest audio quality is going to be the microphone that's locally in Rebecca's room, recording directly onto her computer. So it records it on her computer, and then where I'm at, it's recording onto my computer. So I have two different audio files. I can bring those, when we're done recording, it zips them together and sends them to the host. So I get both high quality recording audio files, and then I can bring those into my software, and I can now take Rebecca's voice and bump it up, because remember, I'm saying she's the soft talker. I can bring her voice up, and I can bring my voice down. If we have the Zoom recording, I'm a loud talker, she's a soft talker. You can't do that because if you bring it up, everyone goes up and then my audio goes up and it's not the best quality. So Zencastr is awesome to make audio adjustments, especially when you've got someone that's got great information that is miles away. And it's really easy to use, and it is free, which is outstanding. The other thing that they always recommend is for your guest, if they don't have a high quality microphone, use earbuds, plug that in the earbud. It's really just getting a microphone closer to your mouth. Having a microphone that's either positioned in your ear, or if you've got the wired, it's down here on your lapel, it's going to be a better recording than what you're recording to your screen or wherever your microphone might be. So if you do those things, you're going to have a good audio recording. And again, it's free. And they also are introducing video, which most podcasts are starting to have some video elements to them. But I'm not going to talk about that. I feel like the beauty of Zencastr is it's free and it's really high quality. Oh, the last thing I'll say about them is they have some type of filter that goes onto their software that the microphones on your computer are pretty sensitive, and they're really they compress the audio. They have some type of software that expands it so it sounds better. It's like a filter that automatically dumps onto computer microphones. So it's just a higher quality audio file that you can get. So we can go to the next. So now we're moving into the formats. So you talked a little bit about this in solo podcast, co-hosted, mixing it up with the formats from the research. What I do in my class is what I would recommend for you is to really develop your series first before you really embark in this. And that's, scribbling down some notes and what is your series going to be? What is the concept? Because that should be the DNA of your show. Every show and every guest should relate back to the concept. So what is it? Concept or theme to your podcast? If it's a series, if it's just a 5 podcast series, or if it's an ongoing show, figure out what are those topics so your audience isn't going to be confused on, okay, I'm tuning in and this was all about women in farming, but now they're talking about rural education and experiential learning. So what is it? You want to make sure you're true to your guests or true to your hosts, and it'll also help you figure out who should be on your show. Structures, I've got links in here to an article on the most used types of structures, but you probably, if you listen to podcasts, you probably listen to either solo podcasts, co-hosted, or remote interviews. Is what people are using these days. In the repurposed content, I would probably fall that into the solo or co-hosted, because they're usually using those things and dumping those into features. There's challenges to both of these things. Solo podcasting, it's really hard to do an engaging 30 minutes of podcast. And then it's also hard to balance a co-host. So it takes some time to develop, and don't get frustrated, or I would highly recommend not having a grind of a schedule, like producing a daily podcast is, unless you're doing this full time, that's nearly impossible, I would say. So we'll talk about release schedules here in a few, but you can read this article that can help you determine what type of style you would like to use. Next slide, please. So what I typically do with my students, and it might be a good exercise, is I have them develop like their concept or their theme, so their DNA of their show. And then I have them break down how their podcast is going to be constructed. So they really have an outline, and I make them do timestamps on this. So having an introduction. Now, the beauty of creating an introduction is if you have an introduction that is really generic, you can use that on every show. So it can save you in production time. It helps it sound professional. You've got branding, you've got some music that people are like, oh, it's that podcast. Yes, that's the one I'm looking for. They know what they're about to get into. And you can see on the left side of the screen, I've got just a basic skeleton outline. Okay, we're going to start every show with current event, and current events are going to relate to my theme. And then we're going to transition into the pre-recorded feature of the day. And that's where you'd be sliding in some of that repurposed content. And then we're going to transition into the summary of what we talked about and maybe have some closing remarks. And then we're going to close it out. Really, really basic. But this can have multiple transitions into different parts. Maybe we're bringing in the live person for the day, and then we have your co-host is always doing a report, which would be the recorded feature of the day. So you have different options and opportunities. I would recommend trying to stick to a outline so your audience knows what to expect. It doesn't mean, like Rebecca was saying, people were kind of mixing things up. As you build your audience, you're building trust. They're going to trust that you can provide that information in multiple ways. But I think while you're building your audience, you want to give them tips of the day or current events or something that starts it off with an attention grabber that's fun. You get them going, stuff they can use, and then we get into another topic. Think about the podcasts that you listen to, the ones that you like, and steal from them. It's not proprietary. These are just formats that people are using all over the place. That's what I would recommend. I have a recorded intro and outro from a student. You could listen to that. We're not going to spend the time because I'd like to get to questions here in a couple more slides. But I've got some other resources in here. Here's a producer's checklist. So this allows you to kind of go through the things that when you're embarking on production, did I do all these things? Am I prepped? Do I have my mic checked? Do I have my Skype call set up? Do I have my refrigerator turned off so it's not having a bunch of noise that's going to be unnecessary in the background? All of these things, this checklist is downloadable from this hyperlink. But this will get you thinking. I use it still when I am doing things. I've done production for years, but there's some things that you miss. You're like, oh yeah, I need to do that. So there's some things that you're not going to be using, probably effects or production levels, unless you have a board or you have that Zoom. But those are just some things to be thinking about. Next slide, please. And then here's some final resources in here. 5 types of hosting options, how to set up your podcast. That's going to help you in your development and building your themes and building your types of stories. NPR has a great article on starting a podcast for students. And I use that in my class, but I don't think it's just for students. It's for people starting podcasts. It breaks it down step-by-step processes and things to be thinking about. And a checklist essentially for starting your podcast. So those are all hyperlinks that will get you into those articles. Next slide. And before we wrap it up, I would talk about time. Now on the research, they were going from 3 minutes to 3 hours. Huge discrepancy. Three minutes is awesome. Because if you can get something out of 3 minutes, you've done your job. 3 hours, not so awesome. And I'm assuming that was probably some type of symposium, and they just dumped on, said, hey, if you missed this, let's play this. I highly recommend shorter is better. You think about people running errands in their car, going to the grocery store. How long does it take you to drive to your grocery? It takes me about 12 minutes. So if I've got a 12-minute podcast, I'm set. The grocery and back. I don't think I have the time in the day for anything more than 30 minutes. But it depends on your audience. If you've got if you're only going to produce stuff that's going to be happening during harvest, and you've got farmers that are out in their tractors and combines, produce a whole mini series and release it in September, October, November, because they're going to have that time to be listening and absorbing this stuff. So it really depends on the audience that you're trying to. The shorter, the better. Our attention span, and we're busy people. A lot of these things are being done multitasking. So think about how long you want yours. And I would always err on the shorter side than the longer. For the resources here, you can download the paper at the hyperlink, and Agricast has a bunch of stuff. If you have any questions about production specifically, reach out to me, and Rebecca and Melissa are available, and we can open up for any questions.
Hey, this is Sherry, and I have a few questions, but I also have another Zoom in like very few minutes. So could you put that in the chat? It's easier for me to copy, and then I'll just send my questions.
Yep, I can do it right now.
Thank you.
I just added a couple of things to the chat. One is the link to Agricast. So if you're interested in some of these resources, you can click there to get some additional information. Also added Troy's email address to the chat. If you've got any production questions, feel free to reach out to him, and he can forward any emails to Melissa and I if there's additional information about the paper or other podcast research that you want. I also sent Heather a copy of the presentation, and I know they're probably going to likely post a recording of the Zoom online as well too. All right, it sounds like that's it. So thank you all for your attention today. It was great to connect with you.